Once again, good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. Just a reminder about silencing your cell phones. And if you're new to Holy Family and you're looking for the restrooms, they're in the back, in the vestibule, women to the right and men to the left. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Ebba Hathout, who is one of our two co-chairs for our Muslim Catholic Dialogue, and the other co-chair is Ed Graff, who was just up here a moment ago. And so Holy Family is truly indebted to the members of the Muslim Catholic Dialogue for the work that they've done to create dialogue, to create opportunities for conversation around our two faiths. So, Dr. Ebba Hathout is the founding president of the Hassan Hathout Foundation, an educational nonprofit organization which is dedicated to the works and philosophy of her late father, Dr. Hassan Hathout. Ebba was born in Cairo, received her school training at the medical school training at the universities of Kuwait, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Cambridge before coming to the US. So she is currently, she's also studied at USC and at the University of California at Irvine and also at UCLA, quite an extraordinary scholar. She is currently the professor and chief of pediatric endocrinology at Loma Linda Hospital, and her passions are spirituality, interfaith work, and medical ethics. And she is a great gift and blessing to this community. And so I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ebba Hathout.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. As a Muslim, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to Holy Family for supporting the Muslim Catholic Dialogue and its events. And I'd like to recognize and thank my dialogue friends and comrades, many of whom are with us tonight. This evening, we're particularly grateful to the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies and the Caruso Catholic Center at USC for co-sponsoring this event. Before I dwell further, I thought I should, on this blessed night celebrating the Immaculate Conception, share a few verses of Islamic scripture about Mary. The Quran reads, "And remember her who guarded her chastity, whereupon we, God, breathed into her of our spirit and caused her, together with her son, to become a symbol of our grace to all people. There came the time when angels said, 'O Mary, surely God has exalted you, purified you, and chosen you over the women of the worlds.' Thus the angels said, 'O Mary, behold, God sends you the glad tidings through a word from him. His name shall be Jesus Christ, and he shall be of great honor in this world and in the life to come. Amen.'" The gentleman I'm about to introduce is by no means foreign to Holy Family. He is a mentor, a role model, a true inspiration. He's professor of religion at the University of Southern California and president and founding director of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at USC. He'd spent many years at the University of Dayton, serving as chair of theology for 6 years, provost for 8 years, and chancellor for 10 years. In 2006, he left the University of Dayton for USC, where he established the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. He's written over 11 books and more than 150 articles and book chapters, including many beautiful works on Muslim Catholic relations and interreligious dialogue. In scanning his elaborate manuscript titles, my most favorite one today was "Wisdom for Presidents." Together with an endowed professorship, he was nominated Professor of the Year by the Gamma Sigma Alpha National Honor Society and was the recipient of numerous other awards, including the Catholic Press Award and the Theodore Hesburgh Award from the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities for his distinguished service and significant contribution to Catholic higher education. He is the pioneer of a unique academic interfaith initiative and the orchestrator of tonight's panel. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to call to the podium Father James Heft.
Thank you, Dr. Hathout. It's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, I feel like I'm coming home. I haven't been around much this past semester. I've been busy about a few other things, and I miss this community. And I acknowledge the leadership of this community, which has been so powerful, not just in Pasadena, but throughout the entire Archdiocese. That talk that Dr. Hathout referred to was actually not meant for presidents of the United States. It was a talk that I gave at a national convention of presidents of Catholic universities. But I like the hermeneutics that you use to transfer it across there. I'd also like to acknowledge this evening Tom and Julie Condon. Tom is on my board. Tom and Julie have been solid supporters of the Institute from the beginning. Tom was part of the initial rush team that recruited us to come, and we chose USC over Princeton and over Yale. And and it was absolutely the right thing to do. Now, I don't want to keep us from the program. I just want to mention a few words about each of the three panelists. These are good scholars who have honed their understanding and their insights, not just by focusing on a book, but by taking people seriously, and particularly people who think differently. It's been a marvelous thing that they've done. When I thought about this possible plan and talked with the people at the Caruso Catholic Center, this would be a good thing to do, I was already clear in my mind whom to invite, because I've known all three of these people for at least 10 years and some longer. And let me just say something about each one of them. Reuven Firestone is an unusual person in the sense that he has spent his scholarly life as a Jew and a rabbi studying Islam and the relationship between Judaism and Islam and beyond that. Dr. Pim Valkenburg, originally from the Netherlands, now teaching at Catholic University of America, has spent his life studying Islam. Both Rabbi Firestone and Pim Valkenburg are respectively devout Jews and devout Catholics. I don't think interreligious dialogue by secular scholars who are specialists in a religion is as valuable as interreligious dialogue by first-rate scholars who also believe in the religion they're studying. And Amir Hussein, I've known for a number of years, is a person who has been able to find effective ways to talk to multiple audiences, has received awards for teaching, and is a person who's also spoken in some of my classes on interreligious dialogue. It's the perfect trio, not the Trinity, but the perfect trio to have here with us. So each of them will speak about mercy within their own religious tradition, and then we'll clear this deck and we'll stack one on top of the other so they're much more visible, because where they are there, you can't see them, right? Rest my case, thank you. And then we'll have them in a much better position so you can interact with them and benefit from their wisdom. So I imagine the next step is to call up my friend Reuven.
Well, I have a lot of introductory remarks to make. First of all, I want to speak about Dr. Hathout, who has been an inspiration for me, but really through her father, who I knew as probably the individual who's most exemplary of grace that I've ever met in my life. A man who exudes beauty and love and has been a true inspiration for me. I've had the privilege of not only knowing Dr. Hathout's father, but also Dr. Hathout's daughter, who was a student who I knew also at the University of Southern California. Also, somehow, this family just exudes a sense of beauty and concern and love for other people, and it is truly inspirational. I have much less to say about, no, I'm just, I know Father Heft for more than 10 years, since before he came to USC formally, and I've worked with him for all that time. And another person who is inspirational, who is a serious scholar and who will not compromise on his values and ethics and his mission, really, to reach out beyond his own community to bring a sense of peace and understanding to people throughout the world. An amazing individual, and I've been blessed to be a student of his. And here I am, as a Jew coming to you, mostly Catholics, I assume, here in this context, and I'm supposed to tell you what Judaism says about mercy. And I want to say from the get-go that I feel a little bit in a defensive position, and I want to be academic about this. So I'm taking my kippah off for a moment, and I'm going to be wearing my academic garb to mention that our religious traditions construct worlds around us that are designed to promote our view of truth. And I'm speaking in capitalist terms because we live in a capitalist world and we kind of think in that way. But we live in a competitive world in which monotheistic traditions have historically felt the need to present their position as a position of truth. And if we are true in our understanding of our faith commitment and our commitment to God, and another monotheistic community that believes in the same sense of a monotheistic God has a different position, they must be wrong. Because if God is all-knowing, omniscient, and all-powerful, then how could God have given different visions to different communities of people? One must be wrong, or let's put it this way, one must be right and the others must be wrong. And so I am speaking as a critique of monotheism for a moment, a critic of monotheism, when I say that Jews and Judaism have critiqued and criticized Christianity as a false sectarian movement doesn't really understand the truth of God, as understanding God through appearing through the incarnation of Christ. Right? This is a Jewish position. There's one position that's right, another position is wrong. And I think Jews and Christians, although we have a lot to argue about, we can come to an agreement that God could not have sent another prophet in the prophet Muhammad, because here we have another position of monotheism that in some significant ways are different from our own. This, I would argue, is a position of personal kind of tribalism rather than a sense of authentic humility in relation to the absolute transcendence of God, a notion that we really can't completely comprehend ourselves. So with that introduction, which I think hopefully will raise some eyebrows here, I want you to understand that I'm coming from a position in which a Catholic narrative has been that the God of the Old Testament is a God of war and anger and punishment and law, whereas the God of the New Testament is a God of love. Jews don't see it that way. There are so many references to God of mercy, God of compassion, and God of love in the Hebrew Bible that sometimes they're not seen by people who already live within a narrative perspective that makes it difficult to read those verses for what we Jews see as being authentic expressions of the divine will. And this is not a condemnation of Christianity or Catholicism. It's a statement of, I think, observation of how religions work. Because just as Christians are trained to see the world in this kind of narrative framework, which I don't think is authentic, so too are Jews trained to see the world in a narrative framework which denigrates Christianity and Islam. What we need to do is to get beyond that and to understand that God and God's great compassion and love might not be fully understood by any of our religious traditions. Perhaps we don't none of us get it completely. And so we need to learn more and deeper, not only in our own religious traditions, but to learn from the best religious traditions of the other. And it's in this spirit that we, the three of us, have come together, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, have come together under the auspices of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies and under the sponsorship and the funding of this institute to be able to explore how we can get to understand better the truth that is really beyond human understanding, because we don't have it all. We don't know it all. And we need to recognize and be humble that even our own traditions, as incredibly complex and beautiful and deep as they are, cannot possibly fathom the absolute transcendence of what it is to be the creator of the universe. And so with that, we come together and we learn from one another. And we disagree with one another. We even sometimes argue with one another. But we do it in love and in respect. And in that process, we've come to understand our own I can speak for all three of us, that we've come to understand our own traditions in much greater depth and much greater sublimity. So I'm not going to go through the texts of the Hebrew Bible in order to demonstrate that the God of the Hebrew Bible is also a God of mercy. I think I'm going to have to simply ask you to accept the truth that, yes, the God of the Hebrew Bible can also be a God of mercy. But having said that, I need also to note that in our tradition, the Jewish tradition, mercy is meaningless if there isn't a sense of justice that accompanies it. If you are only merciful and you are unable to exert the position of justice that sometimes means perhaps punishment, then you're not being, let's say in a kind of parental format, you're not being a good parent. You have to recognize limits, and you have to understand that there is something that is beyond your own personal needs that might require a position of absolute justice. And in the same sense, justice is meaningless without mercy, because there are times when we need to expand beyond the limits of justice to understand mercy in our own relationships with our own fellows, our children, our families, our spouses, and the people with whom we live. And this, I think, is a reflection of God, who combines these two attributes of justice and mercy in order to govern and to rule and to be an inspiration for us as humans on earth. Life is complicated. Thank you for allowing me to address you this evening.
Well, good evening. One of the problems if you are engaged in interreligious relationships is that sometimes it seems to be easier, at least for me, to talk to you about the meaning of mercy in a Jewish tradition or in the Islamic tradition than it is to talk about the meaning of mercy in my own Roman Catholic tradition. So my task, of course, is to limit myself to the Roman Catholic tradition. And I'll do that by telling you a little bit about a meeting I had last Sunday. I was at Caruso Catholic Center at the University of Southern California, and we had this tree lighting events, and we had a prayer before that. And after that prayer, a man came to me who said to me, "Are you a Christian?" "Yes, I am." "You're probably a Lutheran, aren't you?" I said, "Why that?" "Well, because of your accent. You sound Lutheran." I said, "Well, I might seem German to you or whatever, or Scandinavian, but I'm Catholic." "So why are you praying on behalf of the Christians? Because you don't have any authority. You're not a priest, are you?" "No, I'm not a priest. I'm just a lay person." And he said, "Well, do you ever read the Quran?" And I said, "Well, yeah, daily." And he was taken aback for about 2 seconds, and then he came back and said, "Well, I know a lot about the Quran. I'll tell you about the Quran." I said, "Well, okay, go ahead." So he told me about the Quran, that is this awful book that was written by Muhammad in imitation of the scriptures of the Jews and the Christians. And there was a lot of violence in that book, and there was a lot of violence in the Old Testament. But happily enough, the New Testament didn't know any violence, and therefore we as Christians were so much better off than the people of other religions. And he was talking to me for about half an hour, and I tried to get a word in between. I couldn't. So that was a huge failure on my part. Where I want to go with this is, of course, that as my friend and colleague Reuven Firestone told you, so often people make a kind of a construction by saying, well, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, there is so much violence. You have all these texts about warfare, about a revengeful God. And then you have the New Testament where Jesus is the God of peace and love. And then comes along the Quran and things go awfully wrong because there's violence all around. Now, of course, this is kind of a caricature that I make, and a caricature that is often made in the press, because I think one of the things I become more and more aware when I'm working here in the United States, and I'm not originally from the United States, is that we still very often have this idea of Christianity as this peaceful religion and other religions as being not so peaceful. And I always try to say, well, I can see where you're coming from, but if you have any idea of history, you should know better. So what I want to say today is I don't think there is any difference between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam when we are talking about this basic idea of mercy, because I think you can find all kinds of very beautiful texts in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the prophets, in the Psalms, about God as a merciful God, about God as someone who really takes care for the people. And I guess Amir in a few seconds will talk about the idea of Rahmah, because in the Quran, every surah, every chapter of the Quran begins with the idea that God is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. And that's something that you find also in the Hebrew prophets, that God is someone who is really trying to take care for the people like a mother takes care for her children. Because this word rahmah or rahm in Hebrew is the same word as is used for the womb. Thank you. A mother carries her child in a womb, and in Hebrew that's rachamim. And that's the same word as rahmah, rahm as mercy. So, but again, I want Amir and Reuven to make that point. Well, I did it, of course. But I want to say that the New Testament is not so different from the Hebrew Bible or the Quran in its stress on a merciful God. Because the point is, if you want to find texts that emphasize this idea of a merciful God, you will find them in the Hebrew Bible, you will find them in the New Testament, you will find them in the Quran. Of course, if you want to find all kinds of other, let's say, more belligerent texts that call for warfare, you will find them in all the scriptures as well. So my idea is it's not so much what God has put into these scriptures, it is what you want to read in it. And therefore, I think if, as readers of scripture, we really have a huge responsibility, because it is up to us what we find in these scriptures and what we embody in our lives as the meaning of these scriptures. Now, there is one difference, because I don't want to say Islam, Christianity, Judaism, it's all about the same. It's not. The one difference is that Christians say, well, we have seen in a certain person, Jesus of Nazareth, this mercy of God becoming embodied, becoming among us. There is this beautiful text, and I'll read it to you, a very short quotation from the letter to Titus. It's one of the lesser known scriptures in the New Testament. The loving kindness of God has appeared, saving all in Jesus Christ. So this idea of the loving kindness of God was there always, but we as Christians believe that now in Christ it has appeared to us. And I think Jesus, as Pope Francis says, and of course we all know about the Year of Mercy that Pope Francis has inaugurated a year ago and just closed 2 weeks ago, this idea of Jesus Christ as the face of the Father's mercy. So the mercy of God has become visible in the person of Jesus Christ. That is, I think, the point in which Christianity thinks different from Judaism and from Islam. It's not more mercy or less mercy, but it's this idea that this mercy has become embodied in this special person that we as Christians take as our model. And I think if you see that as a kind of a leading idea, you can find so many ideas in the New Testament and in the Christian tradition that gives you this idea of mercy as a leading idea. For today, I've been thinking, well, how could that become concrete, visible for Catholics? And I've been looking a little bit at the saints of today. We're kind of in between St. Nicholas. I'm originally from the Netherlands, so St. Nicholas is a big saint in our country because it's for children and the children gets presents. So we don't give presents at Christmas. We give presents at St. Nicholas Day. So my wife and children, unfortunately they are the East Coast, I'm at the West Coast, so I couldn't be there. They had their St. Nicholas party yesterday. And of course tomorrow, as our Muslim speaker already alluded to, we have the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But in between today we have two saints who in a certain way embody this idea of mercy. We have Saint Ambrose of Milan, a very old saint. He was in fact the teacher of Saint Augustine. He lived from 340 to 397, and we celebrate his consecration as a bishop on December 7, 374. So that is why we have this day. And I think one thing that is interesting about Saint Ambrose is he composed a lot of hymns. He composed a lot of liturgical texts, and he had a lot of preaching abilities. In fact, it was his preaching that got St. Augustine to convert to Christianity. You may know Augustine, one of the biggest teachers of Christianity, and St. Ambrose is a teacher of Christianity himself. It was his preaching of Ambrose in Milan that got Augustine to join Christianity. But maybe there is another person more contemporary that is another saint that embodies this idea of mercy. I must confess I had not heard of her, but I looked it up today. Saint Maria Giuseppe Rossello, who was the foundress of the Daughters of Our Lady of Mercy in Italy. She was born in 1811, became a Franciscan tertiary, and founded a congregation devoting to charitable works, hospitals, and education for poor women. And I found that interesting. It's not just education like so many of us do to the well-off Catholics and to the better people in society, but to poor women specifically. And that is why she founded this idea of the Daughters of Mercy. And I've been looking, do I know them? Are they familiar? So I looked that up a little bit, and that's of course nowadays with internet. But it's not the same as the Sisters of Mercy. So we have the Daughters of Mercy, we have the Sisters of Mercy. The Sisters of Mercy are here in the United States, founded by Catherine Macaulay in Ireland, and then they came to Providence, Rhode Island in the 19th century, which is different from the Daughters of Our Lady of Mercy. But the idea that I want to just give you is there are so many congregations, mainly congregations of women religions, that founded their life on this idea of mercy, and that became visible in their building schools, building hospitals, and building institutions for charity. So I think these are three areas where you can see how mercy in the Catholic tradition, and I must immediately add, also in the Jewish and the Muslim tradition, how it becomes visible and how it becomes palpable, so to say, for people. So I would say that where we as Christians believe that we have seen the mercy of God become visible in Jesus Christ, it is some of these saints and it is some of these female congregations founded in the 19th century that really make that an idea that is central in their life, to build hospitals, to build schools, and to build charitable institutions to make visible this mercy of God. So I hope it gives you some idea of how the Catholic tradition deals with that. Thank you.
So, good evening. I'm old school as an academic. I actually, I believe, to be the last human being without a cell phone. I communicate with my students with this ancient 20th century technology to them, the email. They find that hilarious. I have paper handouts. They may not be enough for everyone. My apologies for that. But I wanted to, first of all, thank Cambria Tortorelli and Monsignor Connolly for inviting us here, and to Dr. Hattuch for that opening. As Reuben Firestone said, her father and her uncle were probably were the two most important figures, really, in the founding of Islam here in Southern California, with the Islamic Center of Southern California. So it's always an honor to be here with her. I teach at Loyola Marymount University, so I'm a Muslim who teaches in a school that, and I want to talk about it, and I didn't know Pim was going to do that, but it was a good segue about the sisters. You know, there's a number of Loyolas, and we very proudly talk about our university as a Jesuit university. But I want to say, but what makes us different? We're the only Loyola Marymount. You know, the Marymount part of that is our other founding order, the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary. And we don't pay attention to them as much as we do to the Jesuits. We also have a third founding order, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange. They're not even included in our name. And so it's a really interesting kind of thing. And I have to, Father Heff said, begin the way you should begin, with a confession. So let me begin, with a confession that I was born in Lahore in a Catholic missionary hospital, St. Raphael's, brought literally into the world at the hands of a nun. Sister Elizabeth. So either that's why I've got a soft spot for the sisters, which is why I think the sisters are important. I began this year almost quite literally at Marymount High School. I do a little bit of work when I can at Marymount High School, and they'd asked me to come and speak to the girls there. And I didn't know at that point, I knew about the Year of Mercy. I didn't know that Pope Francis had just come out with a new book, The Name of God is Mercy. And I thought, what an appropriate kind of thing to have a Muslim talk about this. Because oftentimes we don't think about that. We don't associate mercy, certainly in the modern post-9/11 world, with Islam, even though most Muslims do. Reuven talked about the connection between mercy and justice. If you ask Muslims about the Quran and say, what's the Quran about? Invariably, they'll say it's a book about justice, The paradigmatic, the archetypal story in the Quran is the Moses and Pharaoh story. Not in the Bible, in the Quran. Moses, God's prophet. Pharaoh, the human resistance to God's prophet, to God's justice there. So that's important for Muslims, that notion of justice, but also that notion of mercy. And as Pim pointed out, it's that word that again connects back to the feminine ideas, because the very word in Arabic, Rahman, Rahim, the most common names of God in the Quran, all but one of the 114 chapters of the Quran begin with that phrase, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, the caring, Rahman, Rahim. Even if you don't know Arabic, those are very similar words. And as Pim said, that word, Raham, is a womb. And the metaphor is clear. What literally is more merciful than the mother's womb that for 9 months shelters her child? This is an analogy for God's mercy. That God is as merciful to us as the mother's womb is to her child. And I think about that with what Dr. Hathout had started us off with, that I guess technically, because the day does start in the evening, that it is now today, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and the connection of Jesus and Mary for Muslims. Like everyone in this town, I actually work on a television show. I'm the consultant for National Geographic's The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. If you haven't watched it, watch it. There's 3 new episodes that I think they haven't given us the air dates yet. I think it'll be in January on National Geographic Channel. If you don't know that show, find that show. It's a great show. And it was started actually by Morgan Freeman. It's done by his production company. He was in Turkey. I think they were shooting one of the Batman films. He plays like Lucius Fox in the Chris Nolan Batman films. And they had like some time off from shooting. And so he goes into Hagia Sophia, this church that had been turned into a mosque. And there's up on the ceiling this very famous icon of Jesus and Mary. And Morgan's completely confused by this. He's like, but this is a mosque. Yes. But there's an image of Jesus and Mary in this mosque. Yes. Why is there an image of Jesus and Mary in this mosque? He says, and the tour guide, well, you have to understand, Jesus and Mary are very important for us. The guy was a Turkish Muslim. They're very important for us as Muslims. And I never knew that. And then he took a step back and said, if I don't know that, there's probably a lot of people that don't know that Jesus and Mary are important for us. That's why he committed to this show. It's his own sort of creation. Looks at these really interesting sort of connections there, And so I'm not going to walk you through the list of Quranic verses. We can go over those. But just this idea that mercy is an important idea for Muslims. It's there in the Quran. If you have the handout, my apologies for not having one for everyone, but the back side of it, the one that doesn't have the heading, there's a great thing here that we talk for Muslims about the Quran, which for us are God's words. But then we have the example of prophets ending for us with the Prophet Muhammad. And there's a whole other body of literature, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. And one of the most famous of these Hadith, and this is what the third paragraph on the back side, the Prophet reported that God has written upon his throne, "My mercy takes precedence over my wrath." And this comes from a book about Islam, and the authors, now it's their words, "This precedence is not temporal, it is ontological." In other words, mercy is more fundamental to reality than wrath. That's important. You know, when the prophet says, "My mercy takes precedence over my wrath," he's saying that this is what God has on God's throne. That God's mercy is for everyone. You know, God's wrath is for those who deserve it. God's mercy is for everyone. That's what they mean by mercy taking precedence over wrath. And that's important. You know, how do you see yourself? How do you see mercy in the world? And in this post-election world, I think more than ever, a need for that mercy, a need for that coming together. You know, without getting political, I don't want to get particularly political, but you know, like half the country, of course, didn't vote. You know, that's a whole other question. You know, the half that voted, about half voted for one candidate, about half voted for the other candidate. You know, so this isn't some landslide. This isn't 90% of Americans want one thing and 10% want the other. You know, this is half and half. How do we work together? How do we recognize, you know, the common good? How do we work together? And I say that as someone who's a relatively new American. I was born in Pakistan, grew up in Canada. About 3 years ago, became a U.S. citizen. So with our students, both at LMU and at USC, you know, you've shared that kind of excitement about being able to vote for the first time and participate in that process. And for me, speaking to you, and the you I mean a Catholic you, is that there are really interesting connections, you know, between Catholics and Muslims. You know, we were talking at dinner earlier. I'm privileged to teach at Loyola Marymount University, and Father Alan Deck, who some of you know is the rector of our Jesuit community, I've been talking with Father Deck about bringing in a man that I admire greatly, but I've never met, Bishop Robert McElroy, you know, who's the bishop in San Diego, who spoke in February, you know, about what he called, and I'm using his words, the new nativism, you know, and this was months before the election, to say this kind of anti-Muslim polemic that you hear. To Catholics, that's not new. Because 200 years ago, people were talking about this group of people that came to this country, that didn't assimilate, that didn't speak the language, that had this homegrown violence, this allegiance to foreign powers, princes. You know? 200 years ago, of course, that was Catholics. You know? So for Bishop McElroy, how do you make those connections between Catholics and Muslims? One of the really interesting things that I've seen since the election is the coming together of groups that in my lifetime here in America had not come together. You know, the American Jewish Committee and the Islamic Society of North America, for the first time I can remember, working together nationally. You know, Muslims, Jews, Catholics coming together, working for the common good, for justice, for mercy. And I think we can all use more of that. Thank you.
Perception among Jews, but I was at a dialogue that we had. Richard Cutter, Rabbi Cutter was there too. You weren't able to make it. But we had small group discussions, and one of the persons said about, I think the question was about sin, and she said to me, she says, yeah, but we Jews, we have to do restitution. We have to do justice. We can't just be forgiven by a priest and that's it. I said, where'd you get that idea? As though a firm purpose of amendment and righting your ways, and in fact, building the bridge back with the person you've offended is not an important part of conversion and repentance. So that's just a little story I would tell at the beginning.
So, not to speak for Reuben, but I think for Muslims, like for Jews, there's this idea that, of course, as human beings, we make mistakes. You know, we're not perfect. Only God is perfect. You know, and so what do? How do you rectify those mistakes? You may know of the basic practices of Islam, the faith statement, the prayer, the giving to charity, the fasting during the month of fasting and the pilgrimage. You know, I would argue that the key point of the pilgrimage is this event called the Standing at Arafat, where you spend the day basically standing, asking for God's mercy, asking for God's forgiveness. And the idea is that this is quite literally like almost a dress rehearsal for the day of judgment, you know, where you will stand before God, and some of us more than others in need of God's mercy. And so that sense of how do you make that statement, that intent, asking for God's forgiveness, but often you need that forgiveness from other people. You know, the monotheism that we get from the Jewish tradition isn't just simply a monotheism, it's an ethical monotheism. We have a relationship with God, but because it's the one God who's created all of us, we have a relationship with each other, you know, because we're all brothers and sisters to each other as children of that one God. And so oftentimes it's that sense of asking forgiveness from another person. And oftentimes that's more difficult, you know, than asking God for forgiveness, but you need that forgiveness from the other person.
I think one of the things that I learned in being engaged with Islam is how much Christianity and Islam have in common, and at the same time how much they differ exactly on the point of human sin. Last week we had an event at USC, and one of the questions from the public was about our prejudices. Also thinking about what happened after the election, and people seeing that different groups of people, men and women, white and black, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, were kind of realizing that they belonged to groups that were, let's say, positioning themselves anew, or at least perceived as being positioned anew, and therefore they often saw themselves as threatened in situations in which they didn't see themselves threatened before that. And we discussed some of that, and I said at a certain moment in that discussion, I realize almost every day more and more that the more I try to be reflective about how I engage with others, how you always have your prejudices about others, about people who are not Christian, about women, about black people, etc., etc. You don't realize always, but you carry them with you. And it is often difficult to find language to talk about that in a way that really helps you to recognize these prejudices and overcoming them. And I think that the language of sin can help you to realize that we carry this luggage, so to say, on our backs. And if we say we don't have that, well, we're probably fooling ourselves. So that's one side. And then on the other side, I also want to say, I come from a country, the Netherlands, that is known as a pretty Calvinist country. And Calvinists are known to take sin very seriously. But the other hand is that they often also take the idea of getting right with that other. They also take that very seriously. So the idea of retribution, the idea of reconciliation. Now, I think that sometimes Christians see themselves as persons who are wanting to be reconciled with God, which is something that, of course, in the New Testament is very important. And therefore, it sometimes becomes for Christians kind of a moral obligation to reconcile yourself with the person that has done you some wrong. And I personally know of some cases with women, for instance, who were abused in their youth, who were told you need to be reconciled with the people who did that to you. And that sometimes can carry a burden for people. So I would say Christianity sometimes errs not on the side of, let's say, being too lenient, but kind of a social pressure towards others. You need to be forgiving. And of course, I mean, I would say, yes, of course. Look at Jesus. He says 70 times 7, so you need to be forgiving. But there can be situations in which that is not the right call to people, and that can be a burden for them. So I think that's in this interreligious conversation I would like to bring in that piece.
Well, you're confusing me because now you say you're a Calvinist, but you have a Lutheran accent.
And I'm a Catholic.
And you're a Catholic theologian, so... I also, I think I heard Catholics say you sin and Muslims say you sin, right? So we Jews, nah. We're all confronted with the problem of sin because we make mistakes, and we need to take responsibility for those mistakes, and this is part of our shared tradition. Exactly how we do that in our three traditions has a lot of overlap, but has some particularities that are unique, I think, to our own traditions. And some of that, I think, is actually a result of history and technology. When our religions came into history at a particular period of time, were influenced by the environments in which our religions emerge into history. So in Judaism, in the Hebrew Bible, there's really no explicit reference to reward and punishment in an afterlife. There are allusions that can be understood. Some people would say that is actually stated in the text. Other people would say, no, that's really not. This is a metaphor for something else. It's very, very clear in the New Testament, very, very clear in the Quran that there's reward and punishment in an afterlife. It's not clear in the Hebrew Bible. So Judaism isn't clear about it either. There is a notion of sin, there's a need for repentance, but that does not necessarily mean there is no mortal sin in the Jewish tradition for which one is destined to eternal damnation. In fact, this is something that you might find interesting. In fact, and this is going to sound like a joke, but it's really not exactly a joke, there are expressions of Judaism that say that even the worst offenders who are destined to hell, during the Sabbath, they get off. They get to go home and, relax, and then start the week again back in hell. So, yeah, maybe. But that's, I don't want to use that as a kind of an allusion to take us away from the real problematic of sin. And that is something that in the Jewish tradition we take very seriously. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement for sin. And one is expected to engage in what we call tshuva. The same word comes up in Arabic as tauba in Islam and in the Quran. That one must repent, must make amends for sin, otherwise there's no forgiveness. But it doesn't necessarily mean damnation, and that's something that is perhaps a little bit different in the Jewish tradition. I also want to, point of clarification, I guess, and rules of engagement here. If we all respond equally to every single question, we'll only get through 2 more questions at the end of the evening. So.
Well, shut up.
So we have to kind of, we may not all of us respond to every question, I think. Is that fair? Yeah.
Jim says he'll speak for all of us.
Yeah.
So I can tell that we have a very literate, sophisticated, curious, and a well-informed audience. The breadth of questions, you have no idea. So given that we're hoping to finish in time, I'll let the 4 of you decide who handles what when. Are you concerned about the lack of religious literacy among United States policymakers?
Yes.
I have been leading a senior seminar on religions and violence for majors in the School of International Relations. And the common response from them is, thank God somebody is bringing up and raising the issue of religion affecting international relations. In almost all of our courses, religion is left out of the subject. In 1981, Stansfield Turner, who served as the CIA head under Jimmy Carter, was asked, we asked him, did anybody in your unit see the Iranian Revolution coming in 1979? He says, no, we weren't paying any attention to that.
How do we, as the collective Abrahamic faith believers, change the narrative in the media about the negative vision and views of each other's faiths?
Let me just start there. That's a great question. So, and I've shared this with other folks. A couple of years ago, I was actually writing a book chapter for a colleague at USC, Diane Winston, for a book on television and lived religion. And I was writing about portrayals of Muslims on television. And literally next door to me, in the office next door to me, is Father Tom Rausch, who many of you know, a wonderful Jesuit scholar. And Tom is, a good neighbor, sticks his head in my door and says, hey, what are you working on? And I say, oh, I'm writing about the image, the negative portrayals of Muslims in the media. And Tom just gets this wicked grin on his face, and he says, you think Catholic priests have it easy? You think when they see a picture of me with the collar, what's the first word that comes to people's minds? So I think huge issues there. Part of it for me, and this is when I speak to Muslim audiences, I say, we need to be more involved in this. I don't think there's any great conspiracy. I don't think the media is saying, let's portray Muslims negative light. That's not the agenda there. It's that, most Muslims are, using the example of Dr. Hathout and myself, they're real doctors, or they're, professors who have PhDs but aren't real doctors, or we're engineers, or we're business owners, but we're not in the media. So that's why I would tell Muslim audiences, we need more Muslim writers, storytellers, artists, actors, directors. We need to have our stories told there. And for those of you that saw it, the New York Times about a week ago had a great piece on the weekend about the complexities of Muslims in media, with people like Asif Manvi, who's a Muslim comic, Howard Gordon, who's a showrunner for 24, Zarqa Nawaz, who in Canada did this great show, Little Mosque on the Prairie. How do you pitch those kinds of things? How do you do that? So it's a great, if you watch it. So television fascinates me. In Canada, it was called Little Mosque on the Prairie. You can watch it now on Hulu. It's called Little Mosque. I guess they had to take off the on the prairie bit. I don't know if Laura Ingalls sued or whatever, but I think getting more engaged in that, and that's an issue, I think, for all of us, where 1,000 people or 100 people doing something peaceful isn't the news. One person doing something violent is the news. How do we change that kind of narrative?
Yeah, I think we're all victims of a narrative in which we learn in our monotheistic traditions that there is God represents truth, and as I alluded to, I think earlier, God is all-knowing, and so the truth that God gives us is the real truth. But what happens when we look at another religious community that says, well, look, I have a different truth, and my truth in my scripture, which is a different scripture than your scripture, is the real truth. Now, that's the meaning of faith. We don't say proof. This is my proof religion. We say this is my faith religion. So faith is religion is an aspect of human faith. It's faith in a belief system. You can't prove it, because if you could prove it, by definition, everyone would have to arrive at the same conclusion, because that's the definition of proof. So what I think we need to do in all of our traditions, and this is an agenda item, I don't have an answer for this, but we need to learn how we can believe deeply and fully in our heart that I'll speak for myself, that my religion is best. Not just fine, my religion is good, your religion is good, we're all fine, sweet, but maybe I really believe that my religion is better. Maybe my belief is that God speaks to me and it is truth for me. How can I then relate to a believer of another religious tradition and give that person absolute and full respect as a believer without having to believe in the same truth that I have? That's difficult. Am I making sense? That's difficult. Not just, I think I'm right, you think you're right, everything is relative, fine. There is a truth out there. We probably can't get to it because we're not God. We're only human. But we can believe that we're right. But how can we believe that we're right without denigrating the other? And that's something that I think that we need to learn.
I'll ask the next series of questions because I think there will be commonalities in the answer. Can strong relationships between the Abrahamic faiths be formed when segments of each tradition are engaged in proselytizing of the others? How do you counter bigotry and hate crimes with mercy, or do you? What do you think is the biggest threat to the monotheistic faith traditions today? All our traditions have fundamentalist movements within each. How do each address such groups with regards to mercy?
Since I have the mic, I guess I begin. Let me begin with the first question. Is it possible to have this strong relationship between religions, Abrahamic religions, while you realize that at the same time there are, and let me kind of translate it a little bit, representatives of your own tradition that go the other way? So I think that's true for Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims, that there are people who are willing to engage in dialogue, and there are at the same time people who are totally going the other way, have no interest in dialogue at all, and rather want to proselytize, because that was the term that was mentioned in one of the questions as well. I would say, for me, and I guess I know Reuven and Amir well enough to think that we're on one line here, that for us, dialogue makes no sense if it is done in a way, and I think Reuven just gave an example in which you say, okay, I have my truth, you have your truth, we all have our truth, and let's have a nice conversation about where our truth might overlap. I think that dialogue is really meaningful only if you really put your entire person and your entire faith background at stake. So that means that you should be willing in a dialogue to really come forward with your entire personal engagement in your faith tradition. And that means that on the one hand, you should be totally open and willing to listen to the other, because if you are not willing to listen, nothing will happen. But on the other hand, you also need to be faithful to yourself, which means that if the other asks you, what do you think as a Christian, you should really answer as a Christian, and not try to, let's say, cap off some of the specifics. For instance, think, well, let me not talk about Jesus, let me not talk about Trinity, because that the Muslim will not agree, so we go nowhere. No, I think if you can, on the one hand, be fully open to others, and on the other hand, be fully committed to your own faith tradition, that is a combination that every believer of another faith will respect and will see as authentic. And I think that is a way in which you can be, let's say, at the same time open for dialogue, but also giving witness of your own faith tradition. So I'm not so anxious about talking about your own faith background, because I think that if your dialogue partner really wants to be in dialogue with you, well, that's part of me as a faithful person. So it's part of the deal. And if you see that, I guess if people who are more conservative, who are more wary about dialogue, see that dialogue is not about finding, let's say, the common ground or the greatest common determinator, but it is really about telling about your own background, that might bring us into a new conversation with other people of our own faith who don't like this idea of Abrahamic traditions.
So just a couple of things to address some of those questions that I've always say to my students, look, the point of interfaith dialogue is not that we try to convert each other. The point of interfaith dialogue is that we help each other to find what is meaningful in our own traditions. You know? So that's part of the key. So part of it is learning your own traditions, knowing that. You know? Part of it is understanding the inherent connections between and among our traditions. Those of you who are Catholic, you know, your Christianity is deeply shaped by the encounter with Judaism. And those of you who are, you know, rabbinic Jews, your rabbinic Judaism is deeply shaped by your encounter with Christianity. You know, I had many phenomenal teachers, but Alan Siegel was one of them, who wrote a brilliant book called Rebecca's Children that sort of challenged the paradigm. Because, you know, we thought of the family relationship, Judaism as the parent and Christianity as the child that emerged from that parent. But Alan says, no, this is not the case at all, because rabbinic Judaism is such a break from temple Judaism, you know, that you can argue it's a different religious tradition, you know, that he used the phrase, actually, the title of the book, Rebecca's Children, you know, that here are the sons, Jacob and Esau, you know, in Rebecca's womb, struggling for their share of God's, mercy, if you will, to use our example here. So the connections here, that it astounds my students sometimes. This goes back to the religious illiteracy question. When I tell them that Jesus wasn't Catholic, that he wasn't Christian, that he wasn't European, you know, like we understand that at some level.
White.
Exactly, not even white, you know. But this whole idea that, you know, how do you understand Christianity without that matrix of Judaism, you know? I have colleagues, not to name names, in my philosophy department that I fundamentally disagree with, and, you know, part of it is they see sort of Catholic philosophy as this insular, discrete kind of thing, as if Aquinas wasn't informed by Maimonides, as if Aquinas wasn't informed by Averroes, Ibn Rushd. You know, how do you make sense of this? So the two orders that give the name to my university, Loyola, the Jesuits, Mariamont, the Religious and Sacred Heart of Mary, you know, Ignatius of Loyola comes out of a Spain that is, 80 years or so after the Reconquista. You know, the connections of Muslims and Catholics and Jews in Spain. Father Gaillac, who founds the Religious Sacred Heart of Mary, comes out of 19th century Béziers, France, where you've got Muslims and Jews there, that the two orders that give our names. We talked about Franciscans, you know, the fact that St. Francis encounters in 1219 the Muslim Sultan, so Franciscans have always existed in dialogue with Muslims. There's never been a Franciscan who hasn't had that history. So I think oftentimes, you know, we need to understand that kind of history. Doesn't mean that we don't stay in our traditions, you know, as Catholics, as Muslims, as Jews, but we understand the complexity of those traditions too. You know, and you know that as Catholics, because Catholics are like Muslims. There's about 1 billion of us. The same geographical diversity, the same religious, you know, the difference of observance, conservative, more liberal. Oftentimes the conversations, the difficult conversations, are with people in your own tradition. You may find more in common with someone from another tradition than from your own tradition. And so do you have those kinds of dialogues as well?
So as we move on, in the interest of accommodating as many questions as we have, I won't disregard the elephant in the room. Clearly, there is a lot of Islamophobia in the media. There are questions from the audience that are also suggestive of a level of discomfort with how Muslims are handling atrocities committed in the name of their religion. So one question is, in Saudi Arabia, if it is the home of the holy cities of Islam, why don't they forward to condemn ISIS and the killing of thousands of people. And the comment says, Lord have mercy. And the usual bunch of questions that are not here are, why do Muslims hate us? Why is there so much killing? And it's committed in the name of Islam, so Islam is a violent religion or not, etc. So I'm just going to summarize those questions so that somebody answers, because we do have a number of other very valuable questions that I do want to get to before we're done, but in the spirit of transparency, we need to address those concerns as well.
So I think as a non-Muslim, I'm fully qualified to answer the question. I've been involved in studying Islam. I wrote a book on jihad in Islam long before 9/11. I've been involved in violence in religion. I wrote a book on the revival of holy war ideas in Judaism. I'm very well aware of the holy war history in the Catholic Church, from the Romanization of Christianity in the Byzantine Empire to the really reaching its pinnacle in the Crusades, where massive armies of people went out for the sole and simple purpose in the Northern Crusades to forcibly convert the pagans to Christianity by the sword. I hate to use this metaphor, but the issue is sort of calling the kettle black. Let me also mention, I'm jumping around a little bit. We Jews are not into violence. We've been the victims of violence. We are a quietist religion. The reason that we have been a quietist religion for nearly 2,000 years is because Jews had no power. They couldn't engage in violence because they didn't have the ability to do so after the Jewish community was virtually destroyed by the Roman Empire in the 1st century. It's not because Judaism is a less violent religion than Christianity or Islam, despite the fact that I think it's fully documentable that the New Testament has fewer references to violence in its scriptural texts than does either the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, or the Quran. Historically, it has been documented, I think there's no doubt about it, despite the fact that we're in a period of tremendous violence now in the Muslim world, that Christians have perpetrated more killing and more violence in the name of religion than certainly Judaism and certainly arguably Islam as well. And so we need to take a step back and we need to look. Yes, the Muslim world is engaged in a lot of turmoil, particularly in the Middle East and parts of South Asia, South Central Asia. But the question we need to ask is Islam the driving force? Or there might be other issues that are driving forces behind violence in these areas. Was Christianity the driving force for the Crusades and the mass killings of hundreds of thousands or millions of people? Or were there political and social issues that were also driving these communities of violence? So life is complicated. And if we simply paint an entire community as guilty because of some kind of identity that we are applying to them as a justification or a motivation for engaging in violence, not only are we engaging in a kind of prejudicial act that is unjust, but we're also not going to solve problems, because problems are complicated and multifaceted. So we have to be careful. I hope I'm making sense.
I'm going to move on to the next set of questions. As a Catholic school teacher of 10-year-olds, how do I express the ideas, the commandments of our faith in a way that the children can embrace? How do you, as faith leaders, instill love and peace in your community's rising generation?
Wow. I honestly think by doing what we do, So what we try to do is to show on evenings like this, in programs as organized by Jim Heft and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, that it is possible to build bridges, and that it is possible not only to have meaningful conversations with one another, but even to have fun with one another and to be friends with one another. And I realize that's only a few people. Some people will say, well, that's very elitist. I understand that. But on the other hand, you must realize that 40 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, this was unthinkable, an evening like this. And there are many contexts in which things are done differently. So on the one hand, I think violence is rising, or maybe I should say our awareness of violence is rising. But on the other hand, people who are wanting to build bridges are coming forward, and they are trying to do more and more. So I think there are many examples. That was one of the reasons why I often go to such a thing as saints in the Catholic traditions, because they are examples of people who are building bridges, who are doing the work of mercy, that is really a model for many others. So I think there are many models, and if you ask me, how could you learn children? Well, confront them with these models, tell them the stories about our saints, about the prophets, about the holy people who have really built their life among working with others to lead them on the way to God, because I think that is basically what we try to do. And I think it's done more and more.
So, are there other institutions and other religions who can teach the values of mercy? And more importantly, have we as Christians been lax in the individual exercise of mercy, since we have many institutions which have merciful missions?
Let me just, I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to go back to the other question too, because I think it ties in. I'm serious when I say that my wife is the real teacher in the family. She teaches 4th grade in Burbank. You know, I couldn't do what she does with 32 9-year-olds for 7 hours a day, you know, every day. And she teaches in a public school. She's not in a religious school. But just when you talk about religion, which is there in the curriculum, you know, especially 4th grade, California missions. You know, you start talking about what that means and how that works. And for her, just even, you know, when she talks, she'll say, you know, they're having a conversation about dress. And so, well, you know, you dress up when you go to, like, you know, the church or the mosque or the synagogue. And all of a sudden the Jewish kid perks up, like, you're mentioning my religious tradition. You know, we have great niece, grannies, I'm not sure what the correct term is, I don't know genealogies all that well, you know, who's 2 and her brother's 4. They live in DC, and, you know, we spoil them, of course, because that's what you do as almost in local grandparents, you know, kind of thing. We bought the little boy a Curious George book, but it's Ramadan Curious George. You know, it sort of introduces Ramadan to kids. Not just because his great uncle happens to be a Muslim, but because he's living in DC, where there's some Muslims. We bought the little girl, the Ezra Jack Keats' A Snowy Day. She's a little too young for it, but it came with a doll, which is Peter, this little black doll. And I thought, you know, you need to have that. Like, this little girl, is she just going to have little white girl dolls? Or will she, because she's living in DC, she's going to negotiate with black kids. How do you sort of introduce the fact that there are kids who look different than you know? So I think bringing that kind of difference in is so important. And going back to the first question, absolutely. I mean, it's not just that these 3 religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have the monopoly on mercy, or the only traditions there. They're the 3 that we happen to be talking about here, but we could very easily talk about other religious traditions there.
Asian religion.
Yeah.
I just want to share a humble effort I have done in this respect, realizing that Muslims need to have mercy and love emphasized. The mission of our foundation is to spread the message of love in God. And so I hold a national contest for children ages 10 to 13 called How to Grow a Loving Heart. And that's been going on for 7 years now. And it's just one way of bringing up awareness in Muslim and non-Muslim American children about the value of love and mercy. What are the shared and dissimilar perspectives of the three faiths on the topic of judgment of men by men, mercy in action?
Don't know. But I want to conflate this question with two of the other questions that just preceded it, and to mention that there is a way out of this predicament that we're in today. Did I just lose it? Just lost it. Yeah. I'm back. Irrespective of the recent election, we are seeing an increase in fragmentation of our communities. And there is a solution to the problem, and that is for all of us to engage in mission. It's not exactly the kind of mission that you might think of, but we all have a mission, and our mission is to engage with people who are like us and who are not like us. And we need to exemplify the attribute of mercy and understanding and love toward all the people with whom we are in contact, within our own religious communities and with people who represent other religious communities and racial communities and ethnic communities as well. That's really what it's all about. And right, so here he is, Rabbi, he's very naive, sitting here on the pulpit. It's easy for him to say this from the pulpit. Well, what about us in the pews? And the answer is, no, it's not easy. It will mean being rejected. It will mean not getting, being maybe even insulted. But it shouldn't stop us, because we all come from traditions in which we are taught what is the right thing to do. And we shouldn't stop engaging. And sometimes that means chastising. But not chastising in a way that's going to be just get it off your chest. It means, in the Jewish tradition, it's called tochecha, in which you're obligated to chastise. You're obligated to rebuke your fellow who's doing something wrong. But if you do it in a way that's going to simply contribute to the problem, then you yourself become a sinner. So you need to figure out ways to engage, not just in love and in being sweet, but in love through consistency and doing the right thing. And that's the solution. And we have to convince our children and our parents and our friends and our communities. And with that in mind, I think we can make a difference. That's all we can do, really. We can't rely on other people.
I'd like to thank Father Heft and our distinguished panel for a very inspirational evening. I will end with a couple of verses written by my late father. Friends in faith, rise while you still have a choice. On the wings of love, soar above and sing with your hearts, not only your voice. God is love, God is love, God is love. Thank you very much.